It is my pleasure to announce here. So the last keynote speech is by Caroline Flammer. Caroline Flammer is the A. Barnum Hepburn Professor of Economics at Columbia University with joint appointment at the School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA, where she directs the Sustainable Investing Research Initiative, and also a part of the Climate School, which is another school that they created there. Secondary appointment at the Columbia Business School, lots of appointments. Caroline is also a research associate of National Bureau of Economic Research and many other groups and centers. Caroline is an authority in sustainable investing, sustainable strategy. Again, I was so lucky to have all those keynote speakers with really leading work in several fields. And she's also president of Alliance for Research on Corporate Sustainability, ARCS, which became a really central association in this area. I mean, if you're interested, you need to actually follow ARCS. It's a global network of scholars. Many of us participate. I'm also a board member. It has been great. And Caroline, more recently, she's the department editor of Management Science, which, as you know, it's a leading journal in management, very respected. And she also created a new department there, a sustainability department, where if you're interested, you can submit papers there. So it's really great. So Caroline, it's so nice to have you here and talking about this topic, which is also crucial. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for the kind invitation, and great to see you all again. I'm glad you made it out of bed this morning, because I heard many of the students went partying last night. So thanks for joining this morning. I will build on what we discussed last week on biodiversity finance, and just allow me to make the link to last week, okay? As you know, we are in the midst of multiple crises: climate change, biodiversity loss, social inequality, poverty, and these crises are deeply intertwined with each other. Now, just as an example, and connecting it with last week, as you know, the addressing the biodiversity crisis is critically important and urgent, not only for our own health and well-being, but also for the sake of the planet and the economy. So even if you don't care about biodiversity, nature, and climate, and if you only care about economic growth, you should actually start thinking about nature, the role of nature, but also how these crises, these system-level challenges, affect, for example, the economic growth. So just to give you a couple of examples here, the WWF issued a code red alert for humanity, given that the global species, the global population of several species has declined by more than 70% since the 1970s. Then the UN highlights how deeply intertwined the climate and the biodiversity crisis are. So again, even if you don't care about nature, even if you don't care about the toucans and monkeys, etc., but in order to address the climate crisis, we need to understand how to address the nature crisis. Many of us think about how to finance climate tech, how to finance the transition of the energy sector, and how to abate sectors to net zero. But what we very often forget is the role of nature, correct? And that nature can be a natural carbon sink, for example. Then again, biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis are deeply intertwined, but they are also deeply intertwined with other crises. For example, food security, poverty, conflict and forced migration. If in certain parts of this world it's too hot or too many droughts, too much flooding, etc., and agriculture production goes down and the livelihood goes down, some people will be forced to migrate, and it might also lead to conflicts, which may lead to geopolitical tensions, etc., which we already see playing out in this world. And last but not least, as I mentioned, we need to be very much aware that nature and the ecosystem services it provides represents more than 50% of the global GDP. Okay, so even if you don't care about the system-level challenges, they are actually fundamentally important in terms of our economic health and well-being. Now, what is the challenge of these, for example, of nature and the climate, etc.? Well, these are public goods, okay? Public goods means those who consume them but are not willing to pay, they cannot be really excluded. So this leads basically to an overconsumption and an undervaluation. So they tend to be underprovided and undervalued. The typical way we think about it, how to address these challenges, is through intergovernmental measures and governmental measures, be it the regulation of price or the regulation of quantity. This is just also a repeat of last week, okay? But what I mentioned last week about nature and how to finance nature, it's actually applicable much more broadly to any kind of public good, if you will, correct? So what is the challenge here with intergovernmental and governmental measures? Well, first, they would basically be first best in order to help address efficiently these system-level challenges. But the challenge is they're hard to implement, okay? We've been talking about carbon tax for many, many decades. We've been talking about whatever government regulation for a long period of time. But where is it? What are governments really doing in order to try to effectively address these crises? Okay, so there are many reasons why they may not be able to do so or not willing. But de facto, we have not been able to effectively address these crises. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the midst of these crises. So this begs then the question, now what? Are we doomed? Are we just doomed? Or is there anything else that we could potentially try to do to help mitigate the worst? And so this is where blended finance kicks in. Okay, blending means you blend different types of capital together. So you blend philanthropic with public capital together in order to help improve the risk-return profile of investments and hereby help mobilize, crowd in private capital investments. And so we know, why is this important? Well, if you think about it, historically speaking, the alleviation of poverty, mitigation of climate change, etc., has been funded through philanthropic giving and public giving, meaning development finance institutions, multilateral development banks, and philanthropies have been trying to finance these, the mitigation of these crises. But there's way too little money out there to really address these crises effectively. And so this begs the question, how can we mobilize private capital? There's tons of private capital out there, tons, trillions of dollars, but it just doesn't, that capital does not yet flow in that direction, correct? So how can we redirect private capital, help mobilize it, so that we can finance innovative solutions in renewable energy, climate tech, nature-based solutions, and social inclusion, especially in the global south, where we need the capital the most. And so this is the focus of my keynote today. Okay, so as I mentioned before, what you do with blending is basically you blend different types of capital together, philanthropic capital with public funding and concessional capital, and that helps improve the risk-return profile of these investments and therefore make these investments more attractive for private capital investors to come in. Now, before I move to how a public funder should be thinking about and to basically provide that initial tranche of capital to help catalyze, to serve as catalyst and catalyze private capital investments, we need to understand how private investors think, okay? So let's take the position of a private investor first, try to understand how are they thinking, what are the key decision criteria, and then we flip over to the public sector to better understand where should that capital be invested and how, okay? So from a private investor's perspective, what do they care about? Well, it's easy, risk and return. On one hand, the returns are the direct financial returns. Last week, we talked about the direct monetization mechanisms of investments in natural capital, okay? Then you have the indirect returns, such as biodiversity credits and carbon credits, and you have the so-called impact returns. In case of investments in nature, it would be like biodiversity returns, for example. In case you invest into something else, it's basically the value you assign as an investor, if you care about protecting nature, climate, alleviating poverty or so, you will, so to speak, get a non-financial return out of this, correct? So traditional investors will not care at all about the non-financial returns, but they will care about the direct and indirect financial returns. Impact investors, in addition, will also care about these impact returns, okay? Now, when it comes to risk, and I mentioned blended finance helps blend philanthropic and public capital together to help de-risk private investments. There are different de-risking mechanisms that you can put in place. We discussed this last week, okay? Just as a brief repeat, so you can put in place de-risking mechanisms at the fund level as well as at the project level. At the fund level, for example, there are different levels of seniority, different preferred rates of returns, and financial guarantees that can be provided. And then at the project level, you have concessional funding that helps make it more attractive for the other investors who come in. But then you can also put in place ex-ante risk mitigation tools such as design and preparation grants and technical assistance, and ex-post mitigation tools such as financial guarantees and risk insurance. I'm calling them ex-ante and ex-post because the ex-ante risk mitigation tools, they help improve the probability of financial success of these projects. Think about, for example, prototyping of any innovation, correct? If you have a new innovation, you first prototype it, try to improve it, take care of some defaults, some errors or so, correct them before you scale up the production. Similarly, for local farmers, for example, there might be an NGO who educates the local farmers how to move towards more sustainable business practices, sustainable agricultural practices, and in order to help increase their yield, their produce, but also the quality of the produce, which will eventually allow them to charge a higher price, especially if their produce is certified. Okay, so these are ex-ante risk mitigation tools, ex-post risk mitigation tools. They don't necessarily help improve the probability of success of the project itself, but rather they provide an insurance or a guarantee in case there is some external factor that is happening, such as flooding, wildfire, some disaster happening outside, external to the project itself, basically. And so you might have an insurance company or a DFI, meaning development finance institution, that says, I'm going to back this up just in case something bad happens, okay? All right, obviously, all of these de-risking mechanisms help decrease the risk for private investors and therefore make these investments more attractive. All right, and this is how these deals are structured. And I hope this is a slight refresh of what we discussed last week. And now let me move to the perspective of the public funder. Okay, so again, ultimately, in order to close the financing gap that we are facing, in order to address the societal challenges of this world, we need to find ways how to attract private capital. So we need to understand how do we attract the capital of those guys, not only of the impact investors, but also of the traditional investors. Ideally, we attract the capital of investors such as pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. That's the amount of capital we really need, okay? But for this, you need to understand what are their preferences, what are their restrictions before that money flows. Okay, so let me move to the public sector's perspective. And here I'm drawing on a recent study with two co-authors, Thomas Giroux, who is an assistant professor at the ETH Zurich, he just started, and my colleague at Columbia, Jeff Hill, who just got retired. So both ends of the spectrum, so to speak. All right, anyway, so let me start with the conceptual framework here. So as I mentioned, the objective is to bring in, to mobilize private capital money, okay? One of the key problems is public funding is limited. So you have public funding is scarce. So as an investor, let's say you're a multilateral development bank or development finance institution. So for example, the Inter-American Development Bank would be one of these examples, or the IFC, correct? So you have limited funding available. You will want to use that funding as effectively as possible and as efficiently as possible. So what does this mean? Well, you will want to make sure that only you invest that money if there's market failure, if the private investors are not already investing into these projects, correct? Otherwise, you're just crowding them out. In addition, given that you have limited funds available, you're not going to be able to fund all the projects that would be actually financially viable. So which ones do you choose? Well, probably if the goal is that you serve as a catalyst and you want to mobilize capital investments towards sustainable development, there needs to be a chance that those projects eventually become financially viable. There needs to be a chance that you might be able to create new markets, and so that the market actually works. So it should not be market failure forever, but rather you help to show proof of concept, you help to create markets until the private sector comes in, and then you can reallocate your resources to somewhere else where your money is more needed, okay? So to make this less abstract, let me give you an example. For example, renewable energy or electric vehicles. A number of years ago, people would have thought it's impossible that EVs ever take off, right? Too much was missing, like, for example, recharging stations, etc. But by now, nobody ever questions this, and it's a viable investment for private investors. There's no blending needed. But the way it started originally was with subsidies and basically blended capital, okay? So you try to create markets, but there is a hope that eventually actually the private market kicks in, okay? Second of all, given that you're a public funder, you should devote that capital towards a public good that has positive externalities for society as opposed to negative ones, okay? So this is basically the non-financial additionality. You want to create a positive sustainable development impact that would otherwise not happen if you were not to invest that money. Now, of course, that reallocation of risk creates important concerns as well, correct? So what is the optimum? How much subsidies, how much concessional capital should you provide? As a multilateral development bank, you can invest your money in different ways. One option would be you invest them at market rate, period, just as a regular investor. So why should you be the one taking a financial hit in order for the private investors who are already rich enough to benefit? So how should you think about it, correct? So what's the ideal allocation of risk and return? We don't have an answer to that question, okay? So there are many, many unanswered questions in this space. Blended finance is an emerging phenomena. It has been practiced for a number of years, but in academia, we have absolutely no clue. That field of research basically almost doesn't exist yet, okay? So it's also an exciting opportunity for you all to make a huge impact and really get into important questions and help try to answer important questions in order to have progress in this space, in order to basically help us mobilize more private investments towards sustainable development, especially in the countries that need it the most. Okay, so let me kind of help you illustrate what this means as a public funder, how you will want to invest your funding, your capital, okay? So here on the horizontal axis, you have the project societal returns. This includes the financial returns as well as the non-financial returns. Basically, you can say that this is the sum of all non-financial and financial returns from a societal perspective, while the vertical axis is the project's private return. That's for the private investor. This includes non-financial and financial returns. Now, I mentioned before that public funding should be invested into public goods, makes sense, meaning those that have positive externalities. So you will want to be in that space below the diagonal here, because these projects should all contribute positively to a public good. Then the DFI might have its own hurdle rate where it says we want to have a certain return, financial and societal return, that is above a certain bar. The same applies for the private investors. Okay, so that red dotted line, you can think about it. If a project or a fund performs better than that, private investors are going to invest anyway. There's no blending needed. It's attractive enough for private investors to invest their capital. Now, of course, depending on what type of private investor you are, you will assign a higher, for example, financial return or non-financial return to these projects, especially if you're, for example, an impact investor. You will also value the return you get from saving nature or from alleviating poverty. Okay? So that hurdle rate will differ depending on the type of private investor you are. All right, but you will have a hurdle rate. So above that hurdle rate, private investors will invest anyway. Okay. Now, so what does this mean for the public investor? So area 1 and 2, you should basically ignore as a public funder because those projects have actually negative externalities, okay? So stay away from it. Sadly speaking, they get funded anyway by the private sector because they are financially viable. Area 3 would basically be very attractive for DFIs and MDBs. So DFIs, development finance institutions, MDBs are multilateral development banks. In order for me not to break my tongue today, I'm going to just use the abbreviations, okay? So for MDBs and DFIs, area 3 is basically very attractive because you get a high return and high impact, correct? Positive externalities. But the private sector is already investing into these projects, so there's no need for your money. You should really stay out of it. I'm saying you should stay out of it because this is not necessarily what the MDBs and DFIs are doing, okay? So if you were to invest into number 3, basically you potentially crowd out private capital as an investor. Okay, areas 4 and 5 you should also ignore because they are below your own hurdle rate. And so the area that is really relevant for you to consider to invest your public funds is area 6, okay? So these are the type of projects you should be potentially considering. The question is, which projects are you going to fund? Because you still don't have enough money to fund all these projects in that space, okay? So let me now help you think through this. So let's assume we have project 1 and project 2. Project 1 has higher expected societal returns and a smaller degree of concessionality is needed, a smaller degree of subsidies is needed for the project to become commercially viable and for the private sector to come in. Think about the EVs that I mentioned before, okay? Compared to project 2. Here it's clear, project 1 dominates project 2 because you have both higher expected returns but also a lower degree of concessionality that is needed, meaning it is cheaper for you to help subsidize the project and get it to a level where basically you create new markets or you just show proof of concept until other investors should come in, okay? But the case is much less clear in this case where you have project 1 that has a smaller expected societal return, but also it's cheaper for you to basically get it up and running compared to a high impact project. You can just as an example, you can imagine, let's say, a disaster, an area that is from a war zone or so. So first you start with disaster relief, but to really build that up, to really build up that community, it's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of money, a lot of grants and aid before any private investor would ever think about investing into that area, okay? That's a potential high risk, high return project, and you know you would have a huge impact, especially on these high risk frontier markets, but it's a much heavier lift in terms of financially speaking, and so you might want to consider another project like project 1 that has a smaller expected societal return, but it's a much smaller lift, and you might be able to then fund several of those, correct? So which ones are you going to choose? It's not that clear. But all else equal, you would expect that the higher the expected societal return, the more you're willing to provide a higher degree of concessionality. Okay? All right. Now, 2 characteristics that are correct, that are typical for high-risk frontier markets. One is increased country risk, such as increased political risk, increased currency risk. Now, how does that affect their calculation? So this is the case in many lower income countries, correct? A high degree of political risk, as well as high degree of currency risk and other type of country risk. What does this mean? Well, the higher the country risk, private investors don't like risk. They will want to see a higher expected return to compensate for taking additional risk, okay? So their hurdle rate goes up. That means the set of relevant projects for where the MDBs and DFIs come in increases, but so does the needed degree of concessionality in order to help fund these projects. So it becomes much more expensive to make these projects commercially viable at the end of the day, okay? Relatedly, also something typical in lower income, high risk countries markets is the higher degree of information asymmetry. This might be caused by, on one hand, investors, if they are not from the same country, investors might be less familiar with the local business environment. And so because of that lower degree of familiarity with the business environment, they will have a harder time to assess the economic value of these investments or the societal value of these investments. It could also be due to, for example, especially when it comes to nature-based solutions and social innovation, investors are not used to understand what's the economic value of these investments. Think about it. How many students in business schools, how many professors in business schools do you know who are expert in ecology and finance? It's almost a set of zero, okay? So to understand really what's the economic value of an investment into protection of nature, for example, of the Amazon or of the Caribbean islands, the coral reefs, etc., of the mangroves, protecting the land, but also providing protection for fish, etc. Understanding that economic value is so much harder for traditional investors, and therefore, basically, you can argue that it's like an information asymmetry, okay? Lastly, another potential reason why there is increased information asymmetry is because there might be a lack of mandatory disclosure requirements in that country, especially when it comes to non-financial information. We talked a lot last week about measurement and disclosure. Now you can imagine, first of all, how do you measure biodiversity? Huge question. But then also, how do you disclose it in a meaningful way, okay? If there is a lack of disclosure, it's going to be very hard for investors to understand what's the value. The question is whether they value biodiversity in the first place or the alleviation of poverty, etc. But even if they value the alleviation of these societal challenges, if they don't have the information at hand, it's going to be hard for them to integrate this into their assessment, okay? So anyway, so what does it mean now, going back to this graph, what does this mean? Well, it means, again, lack of transparency. Investors don't like information in transparency. That means they will want to be compensated for that lack of transparency. Their risk-adjusted returns, the expected hurdle rate goes up. That means the set of relevant projects for public funds to invest in goes up, and so does the degree of concessionality needed to make them commercially, financially viable for private investors, okay? I hope that helps. So let me now take this to the data, okay? To see, do we actually see this empirically? Do we have any evidence of this? So we use the data from the IFC, which is the private sector arm from the World Bank. It aims to finance advanced sustainable development by investing in for-profit and commercial projects. And basically, it follows those rules about non-financial additionality and financial additionality. So it's supposed to only invest if there's a market failure, if the private capital is not yet flowing. And it's supposed to only invest into projects that positively contribute to sustainable development, broadly defined. So sustainable development meaning economic, environmental, and social development, okay? We have deals, we have all blended finance labeled deals over the period of 2018 until 2023, and these deals are still ongoing. So that also means we don't have realized data, okay? So let me show you a couple of statistics, and I do want to have time for opening up and have a conversation. When you look at where the money is invested in, it is invested primarily in the global south, quite a bit in, about 50% into Africa, about 22% into Asia and Pacific, 12% in Latin America and the Caribbean, etc., etc. Then, when you look at which industry that they support, you can see that a lot of funding goes into the financial sector, actually. This might be at first surprising to you, but if you think more deeply about it, it's not that surprising, because what they try to do is help build up the local financial system so that then the local banks, once there are local banks and a solid financial system in place, they can lend the money to the local businesses, correct? This way you also avoid the currency risk that I talked about before, and a lot of this information asymmetry. So there's a lot of, it makes sense, but at first it's kind of surprising, wait, we're talking about sustainable development, why are we investing here the funds into financial sector, correct? Then also not so surprising is a lot of funding goes into agribusiness and forestry. I'm saying this is not so much surprising because, well, first of all, the food basket of this world is in the global south, correct? It's fundamentally important that we understand how to channel more funding towards lower income countries that are actually also fundamentally important for providing the food supply for the rest of the world, for their own countries, but also the rest of the world. It's also important when we think about climate change. Again, a role that we very often forget is the role of nature to help mitigate climate change. And if you think about how do you manage, how are you as investor or business person able to control at all nature, if there is such a thing? It's when you look at where is most land used for what, and this is agriculture and forestry. So it's important, okay? All right. Now, this is probably less of interest, but in terms of financial structure, so the loans and equity are used, as well as different risk mitigation tools, such as cross-currency swaps, again, to address that currency risk. First loss guarantees, risk-sharing facilities, etc., etc. Now, this is a slide I want to stay on for a little bit. So here we don't have impact data, okay? So we went ahead and read each single proposal, each single project description, and we coded them into what kind of societal challenge, SDG challenge, do they try to address. And so a project can try to address multiple of these SDGs, okay? Now, if you look at it, you can see that many of these projects are about decent work, economic growth, industry innovation, and infrastructure. These are traditional economic SDGs, basically. It makes sense because economic development is fundamentally important, okay, especially for lower income countries. But you can see that the other SDGs are much lower. And so essentially, if we think blended finance can potentially serve as an important catalyst to crowd in private investment towards SDGs, and if we think that this can be an important tool to help mitigate climate change, poverty, and biodiversity loss, etc., well, then that money is not flowing into that direction yet, or it's not optimal yet, because otherwise you would expect to see a much higher overlap between economic growth and social, or economic growth and climate, correct? So nothing would prevent them to consider, yes, it's important to create jobs, absolutely important to create jobs and economic development for the countries, but that does not necessarily mean that it's against climate solutions. Okay, electric vehicles would be renewable energy, electric vehicles would be some of these examples. So you would expect to see much more of an overlap between the econ SDGs and the others. And so this is potentially a conversation we need to have with MDBs and DFIs, etc., to consider to take a more holistic approach towards sustainable development and not only favor basically the econish SDGs. Okay, then very briefly, so we test these hypotheses. Okay, so this is purely correlational. There's absolutely no way to get at causality here. but bear with me. So what we are looking at is, do we indeed observe that projects with a higher degree of expected sustainability impact, do they really show a greater degree of concessionality? And the short answer is yes, we do, regardless of which specification we use. Okay, we do find that projects that have a higher expected impact, so to speak, they do get more subsidies. And we also find that countries with increased country risk, in those countries, the deals have a higher degree of concessionality and more de-risking mechanisms in place. Very much supportive of this notion that in countries where you face more currency risk, more political risk, or I should say perceived risk, where the risk perception is higher in terms of currency risks, etc., you also see more risk mitigation tools put in place, which makes a lot of sense in order to help attract private investors. Okay. And lastly, information asymmetry. Here we look at how transparent is it to actually do business in a certain country. We look at the open data inventory, the opacity score, and again, supportive of what we predicted, that in those countries, a higher degree of concessionality is needed to help crowd in private investors to make these investments more attractive for them. Okay? All right, let me conclude here and open up for conversation. So we face an enormous financing gap, not only in order to finance the mitigation of climate change and adaptation to climate change, let's face it, but also in terms of mitigating nature loss, social inequality, poverty, etc. We face, and so the question is, how can we mobilize more private capital investments to finance innovative solutions, especially in the countries that need that capital the most, and hereby drive forward sustainable development? There's tons of private capital out there, but it does not yet flow neither into societal, environmental innovations, nor to frontier, high-risk emerging countries. Okay, so a lot of, for example, there's a lot of money, not a lot of money, but there's a decent pool of capital available for climate finance. But when you look at where is that capital invested, it tends to be in the global north. Okay, so it's really, the key is really how do we channel that capital towards those countries that need the capital the most. It's not a lack of innovations. There's tons of innovation going on. There's tons of indigenous innovations going on in local communities, but they don't find the capital to finance their startups and scale their productions up, correct? So blended finance can potentially serve as an important tool to help crowd in and mobilize private capital. Obviously, the ultimate goal is not to maximize blended finance, but rather to see it as a transition until proof of concept is shown, until new markets are created. But ultimately, blended finance should morph into sustainable investing and basically just simply investing into these projects. Okay. Now, a question is, okay, so blended finance has existed for a while, but why hasn't it scaled up? What's the problem? Well, there are different factors that we need to work on in order to help improve the efficiency of this market and the scalability of this market. And let me just mention a couple of them. One is, for example, there's a huge information asymmetry. You have different capital providers, and they don't talk to each other. Philanthropies work very differently from MDBs and DFIs, and they work very differently from private investors, be it from family offices, venture capitalists, angel investors, asset managers, and then pension funds and so on, wealth funds. Okay, we have very little idea about these different private investors, different investors more generally, not just private. We have very little idea about what are their restrictions, what are their preferences, what are their appetites and missions. Correct? It's surprising, but we really have very little idea, and there's a lack of communication across these investors. So making progress on that front would help tremendously. It's also, so we did a survey. I need to write up that study actually, but we've done the survey already. when asked investors, why don't you engage in blended finance? So none of the, we did that survey with a whole range of capital providers. None of them responded too high of a risk and too low of return. Nobody, okay? Absolutely zero answer there. The number 1 and 2 main reasons for not engaging in blended finance constructions is outside of their mandate. For example, sovereign wealth funds, they might not be allowed to invest into unlisted assets. And secondly, lack of organizational in-house understanding of what blended finance is. And so they stay away from it. So that means education and training plays a really important role here. Educating not only the wealth managers, but also the family offices and capital owners about how could they actually be, if it's a foundation or a family office, for example, how could they serve as catalyst? How could they achieve the impact that they want? And actually, by serving as catalyst, they can even multiply the objectives that they have on their own, correct? But there needs to be an understanding of it. Obviously, we also need to revisit the regulations around, for example, philanthropies. What are they allowed to do? What are they not allowed to do? Are governments providing favorable business environments for such deals, etc.? Then another aspect is a lack of common metrics. We talked a lot last week about, for example, how do you measure biodiversity? How? When it comes to climate, most of the people look at CO2. That's fairly straightforward, correct? But how do you measure other factors? How do you measure progress in terms of developing more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable communities? How do you measure health and well-being, actually? So all these questions, we need to make progress on these questions. How do you measure these? How do you track progress? But then also, obviously, interpret and include these measures in the investment decision-making process. And as I mentioned before, there's an absolute, almost an absolute lack of rigorous studies out there. I encourage any one of you to really think through it. What are the critical questions? And get into this space. We need to make progress. And for this, we need to move beyond case studies. So we have developed case studies actually also on sustainable investing, blended finance deals focused on Brazil. The booklet is on my website. Okay, so at this moment, case studies are very helpful as a blueprint for organizations and for helping them understand how to do it. But we need to move beyond case studies to really make progress. Okay. And then, developing standardized metrics and frameworks would be important. And again, we need a better understanding of the challenges and opportunities that arise. And here you have a couple of them, but I do want to open up for questions if we still have time for that. Okay.
Good morning. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was amazing, but I was curious to see something that we are talking about, weapons and bombs, especially about nuclear bombs that I didn't see. My question, do you think the government and intergovernment measures we discuss generally help vulnerable countries, or do they mainly function as a new pressure that limit their development, especially considering that many powerful countries achieve their own development through early industrialization, military expansion, and even the production of nuclear weapons? And are we now setting new restrictions for countries that are in the process of development? Thank you.
Okay, that was a long question. Let me try to distill it.
If you want, I can.
Very important question. Okay, and for sure it cannot be. And this is what you see a lot in governmental talks, intergovernmental talks, almost like the imposition on the not yet economically developed countries that you need to strangle everything for protecting nature or whatever it is, correct? You need to help us solve the problems of this world, but you're not allowed to economically develop, almost like this one. That's a little extreme. That's I phrased it a little bit too extreme here, but this is not the approach to go, correct? So what is critically important to understand, how can this be a business opportunity? We are not talking about regulation here. We are talking about scaling up and financing and scaling up viable solutions, business solutions, and help fund these solutions. That means there is economic development there because this is the revenue generation there, right there, okay? So for example, if we think about protecting the Amazon, the answer cannot be all people move out of the area. We don't care about whether you are able to put food on the plate of your families. That cannot be the answer in order to protect nature, in order to help protect the world, correct? We need to be really sensitive about, so how do we go about it? How are we able to provide jobs and employment and business opportunity? How are we economically empowering the local communities while protecting nature? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think you're putting some words into my mouth that are not, that I was not talking about. But I hear you that this is very often, basically the conversation is going that way. But this is not what I'm proposing here.
No, it's okay that you're mentioning that, and I would like to add something. Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you for the amazing talk. I thought it was particularly interesting, the table about the SDGs, and I was wondering if this is something particular for the blended finance case, or if we look at philanthropy in general, something similar comes up. I don't know if you guys have the data to do that.
Yeah, we don't have the data on philanthropies per se. I mean, philanthropies, they tend to have a mission, not financially, not economically speaking, okay? They care about, let's say, gender, they care about climate, they care about specific aspects. But the key for philanthropies is, for example, to understand, first of all, philanthropies, I think in most countries around the world, they would be allowed to do both grant making, but also program-aligned investment. So investments where they do achieve a financial return, below market return, but a financial return, and then they can use that return to further reinvest, correct, and support whatever the mission is. Many foundations don't do that. Okay, so for example, when we focus on Brazil, we realized that somehow local foundations don't really engage in neither in blended finance nor in program-aligned investment. And when asked why, they say they are afraid that they are associated with for-profit investors, and or their own. If they on their own do program-aligned investment, that they are afraid to lose their status as non-profit organization and would need to pay taxes on it, because the government would interpret it in a way that, wait, you make a financial return here, correct? So they don't really engage in program-aligned investment. At the same time, they don't provide grants towards blended finance deals to serve as catalyst for similar reason. They don't want to be associated with private investors, basically because they fear the government would take away their status, correct? So that's like on one hand, we need to talk with the local regulations, governments, about clarifying what is allowed to do and not, because it's in the government's interest at the end of the day to understand how do we attract, how do we provide an enabling environment that allows to provide that first concessional capital, be it through a development finance institution or foundation. But if you don't even have the foundations providing their capital, who is, correct? And obviously foundations need to be aware of the opportunities that they have. So this is like, there's a lot of different investors. There are conversations to be had in order to help improve this. But yes, so in terms of foundations, you would not expect the same SDG table. You would rather expect that they only invest into, they need to provide the funding towards their mission, correct?
So hello, thank you for the presentation. I have two questions. They are like connected, and they are very similar, but I didn't manage to do just one. So the first one is relating like if I understand right, we're like here in Global South, we're trying to manage to attract foreign investors, right? For example, from the north. So one thing we have here in Brazil, for example, is the case of Ford. So Ford came here, we concession her tons and tons and tons of subsidies. and they operated here for like 20 years, I believe. And once we decided, okay, it's enough, they can like operate by themselves. When we did that, they left. So for like foreign investors, there's always this is a possibility. Like when we cease our subsidies or our concessions, they can just leave. Like how we prevent that from happening?
Yeah, very good question. And as you say, basically the starting point is, for example, the local community or government, municipality or government providing, let's say, subsidies or tax incentives or something, correct? And then on top of that, what kind of concessional catalytic capital can be provided to help? If this is not enough to attract capital, private capital, you might need concessional capital from other sources. How do you avoid, so if the government then says stop the subsidies, this is precisely where, on one hand, you need to think about focus on those industries and projects where there is actually a chance for making it, building up the market in the first place. Like providing subsidies over decades is probably not the most meaningful way to use the funding, correct? So focus on those where there is a chance to actually serve as catalyst. Now, if let's say the government doesn't provide subsidies or tax incentives in the first place or pulls it out, this is where it might still be in the interest of foundations or development finance institutions to provide that concessional capital or to help de-risk these investments, so that basically it's almost like playing the role of the government then, correct? To help make these investments more attractive for private investors to come in. I hope that answers your question. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity for hearing from you. I have been in Germany for the last year at the university, and I have worked with some proposals application. And what I have heard from them is that they are struggling to get proposal approved because of the war and this increasing situation.
And where was that? Sorry.
Sorry?
Where was it?
I was in Hamburg, the north of Germany.
Okay, good.
Yeah. And my supervisor said that the investment was directly towards the military equipment. So the research and proposals are struggling to fight against these investment. And I would like to know from your perspective, how can we show in these financial proposals the socio-economic value, especially when we're talking about the traditional investments, especially Germany in this sense, how we can position ourselves in the project.
So let me ask a clarifying question. So why did they fight back? Or
Yes, because the amount value of the ministry is getting low to the research projects. So they are investing more in war things, and the science is get a lower budget. So in the end of the day, the education and these kind of things are struggling to continue researching, to keep going the research center and these kind of things.
and the research center is on what?
We have these research center on sustainable development and climate change.
Okay, that might be a longer conversation after this talk. But I mean, how do you show value, correct? How do you show value to funders, you say?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of financial support that I'm talking about, it's like the government, the national government, and the European Union in general.
I mean, so we talk about it afterwards, but just in general, if you think about how to attract funding, you need to understand, so who are the different investors out there and what do they care about, correct? Like one is financial return, and to make sure that the monetization mechanism is clear, loud and clear to them, that might need some explanation to do. But then, for example, the non-financial returns, not all investors will care about non-financial returns, correct? So understanding which investors, which capital providers actually care about non-financial returns, and then speak their language. You need to speak their language, understand how are their decisions being made, and then try to show the value this way. We'll talk afterwards.
Hello, here's Jefferson. Hi,
Oh,
Caroline.
yeah.
Yes, I'm just in front of you. Thank you very much for our very insightful and really interesting topic. My question is, from the perspective of improving private capital flows to countries in the Global South, how do institutional factors such as the rule of law, judicial predictability, corruption, and government stability shapes investor perceptions of risk? And to what extent can weakness in these institutional dimensions contribute to a decline in private capital inflows to these countries? Thank you very much.
Good question. This is what I tried to allude to with the kind of extensions of what happens if country risk is higher. One could be political risk, currency risk, corruption, all these, correct? What does this mean? Well, private investors, they perceive this as an increased risk. And if there is increased risk, they want high risk, high returns. Private investors are very easy to understand. That's all they care about, correct? So that means their risk perception will be higher. So now what can you do depending on who you are? If you're the local government, well, try to beat corruption. Easier said than done. But then could you potentially, this is maybe then when other actors, so one is the government can try to provide as good of a business environment as possible. But let's say if the local government or national government is just useless in that sense or not helping, that's maybe where multilateral development or DFIs can play an important role in saying, we provide the guarantee. So if anything happens, we cover the loss, correct? Or it might be an insurance company or whatever, like whatever the concern is, that you take this, you provide that risk mitigation tool to help improve the trust in these investments. And so if something goes wrong, then somebody else covers you. It might also be local philanthropies then, or local family offices who say, we care about that region, we really want to see this region flourish, to contribute to the health and well-being of the current generation and the future generation. We are willing to signal, you see what I mean? But this is all about how do you decrease the risk. One is how do you decrease the actual risk? And the other aspect is how do you decrease the perception of risk? I mean, how do you better align the perception of risk with the actual risk? Okay, these are two components, and ideally you improve both.
Really quick.
It's never quick when he asks a question, you know that.
No, it's for the benefit of the students.
Oh, now this is a hard one. Okay.
No, I'm actually trying to leverage your experience in working beyond the data and with the people behind it. In your presentation, there was at least an assumption or implicit assumption that each individual investment project is a standalone one and there's no portfolio approach. Then my question is for you maybe to tell us whether some of these projects are not independent units, but they are actually coordinated such that they together achieve higher impact rather than individually.
So from investors' perspective, when they think about portfolios, for example, they do think across probably, but it's not there's no data on this one, correct? So let me put it this way. Ideally, investors would take a portfolio approach, and ideally investors would take a systems approach. Sadly speaking, very often they don't, correct? You can see it with just traditional investors, let's say stock market. That's the whole, one of the issues in the current way finance is being practiced is the focus is very much on portfolio and portfolio performance, and they don't consider the overall system and how they contribute or are at risk of the system, correct? So ideally, investors, each investor for themselves would take a portfolio approach and also think about how do these investment projects hopefully reinforce each other towards the resilience of the broader system, okay? But in addition, ideally investors would also to some extent collaborate across investors to think about what role can each one of them play for whatever. We are not trying to change the preferences or objectives of these type of investors, but let's understand what do foundations want to achieve, what do family offices want to achieve, what's the goal of DFIs and MDBs, and then all the way to pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, correct? Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, they have a long-term view. They need to, their fiduciary duty is to contribute to the long-term health and value of their funds, correct? To support future generation retirees. What does this mean? So in a sense of we need to understand each one of them, not change their preferences per se, but rather understand and then take a portfolio view across investors, ideally. You can see ideally because there's lots of room for improvement. We need to think about executive education here.
Thank you so much, Caroline. That was excellent. Thank you. This is a very important topic, and several of the participants also have very interesting projects that could be funded with blended finance, right? And here at Insper, we're discussing with Andreas to see if we can also move this agenda forward with data collection. So this is great. Yeah, of course. Yeah.